What is Orpheism?
Orphism, sometimes called Orphic Cubism, is a movement that developed within Cubism and is characterized by abstractions and rhythmic color arranged to emphasize the joyous power of creation and the relationship between visual art and music. The name Orphism was coined by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire, 1880–1918, and the name refers to the mythological figure Orpheus, a poet whose beautiful lyrics and music could seduce wild animals. One of the major artists associated with Orphism was Robert Delaunay, 1885–1941, who passed through a Cubist phase and experimented with color theory and concepts of space. Much like his fellow Cubists, Braque and Picasso, Delaunay created color abstractions such as simultaneous contrasts, sun and moon. 1913, that relied on color interactions to create a sense of depth and movement. Delaunay's wife Sonia also created Orphic works, including paintings, collages, and clothing designs. By 1914, Apollinaire and Delaunay could no longer agree on the main tenets of Orphism and the movement ended.
Why is time smoking a picture?
The work of William Hogarth, 1697–1764, is a good example of Rococo's more satirical side. The English Hogarth, a painter and engraver, ran in literary circles that included his friend Henry Fielding. His work frequently contains clear moral messages and biting social commentary. For example, his series of paintings, titled Marriage à la Mode, 1743–1745, satirizes arranged marriages and cautions against vanity, betrayal, and vices such as drinking and gambling. Hogarth's etching, Time Smoking a Picture, also communicates a very specific message from the artist. At the center is an aging personification of time, complete with wings and a scythe, time's attributes. He sits glumly in front of a large framed canvas, shoulders hunched, blowing smoke directly onto the painting with a long, thin pipe. The nude Time sits upon a piece of broken sculpture, and his large scythe has fallen forward, slicing a hole in the painting. Next to him is a large jar of varnish. An inscription in Greek is written across the painting's frame. It reads, "Time is not a clever craftsman, for he makes everything more obscure." In printed text just below the figure of Time, another message reads, "As statues molder into worth." And finally, a caption at the very bottom of the print says, "To nature and yourself appeal / nor learn of others what to feel." Hogarth is commenting on a common 18th century practice of using varnish and smoke to make contemporary works of art look older, and therefore more expensive, as older works of art were deemed more valuable than new ones. Time Smoking a Picture powerfully communicates Hogarth's criticism of the fact that art dealers were willing to destroy works of art to make a profit.
Who was Francis Bacon?
Francis Bacon, 1909 to 1992, was a British painter whose expressive, figurative works often depict scenes of psychological horror. Bacon is often categorized as an existentialist artist. His paintings of Pope Innocent X were modeled after a portrait done by Velázquez in the 16th century. However, Bacon's Pope sits within the confines of a cage-like throne. His face smeared with aggressive streaks of paint against a menacingly black background. Bacon's paintings depict intense scenes of anguish. The artist himself said, "I hope to make the best human cry in painting. To remake the violence of reality itself," as quoted in Stockstad 1128.
What is lithography?
Lithography is a method of printmaking in which the artist draws an image on a smooth, polished stone with a special dense crayon. Ink applied to the surface of the stone clings to the greasy crayon, allowing the lithographer to press the image and make a print. Developed in the late 18th century, lithography allows the artist to draw freely, without carving.
Where can I find art resources online?
There are so many websites about art that looking up art online can turn into information overload. Here are a select few websites with a wealth of information on art, presented in a straightforward and often entertaining way. Heilbronn Timeline of Art History at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. http://www.metmuseum.org/toah. This incredibly detailed site combines detailed explanations of art movements and styles with explanations of specific works of art held in the museum's collection. It is a great resource for Western and non-Western art alike. If you can't make it to New York, looking at the Met Museum's timeline of art history is the next best thing. Google Art Project, http://www.googleartproject.com. A visit to Google Art Project is like stepping into a virtual museum. Roam the halls of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, or the Tate Britain in London. Dozens of museums opened their doors to Google in 2011, allowing cameras to film their interiors in a manner similar to Google Street View. After broadening the project's scope in 2012, tens of thousands of works of art from around the world can be seen online through the Google Art Project. Smart History presented by the Khan Academy, http://smarthistory.khanacademy.org/. Smart History is a great place to learn more about art movements and specific works of art. The site provides written essays, and video and audio guides to some of the most famous paintings, sculptures, and works of architecture around the world. Recently, Smart History has made an effort to include non-Western art. Smart History multimedia presentations are engaging and highly informative.
What was Catalhuiac?
Catalhuiac was a sophisticated, urban-like Neolithic settlement that developed about 1,000 years after Jericho in present-day Turkey. The densely clustered houses of Catalhuiac were made of timber and mud brick. The village had no streets and the houses had no doors. The villagers entered their homes through the roof. Many apparent religious shrines have been found at Catalhuiac. Though nothing is known of specific religious beliefs practiced by the inhabitants here. Naturalistic figures made of clay and stone have been found at the site, including representations of animals such as goats, cattle, and boars that appear to have been ritualistically stabbed in a manner that suggests hunting rites. Stylized female figures have also been discovered with pointed legs and angular faces, along with larger figurines that scholars associate with a commonly revered Great Mother deity. Catalhuiac is also notable for its paintings, including a wall painting of the town itself, with Hassan Dag, a nearby twin-cone volcano shown hovering just beyond the village limits. This wall painting is among the earliest paintings ever done on a man-made surface.
What is medieval expressionism?
Medieval Expressionism was a style that emphasized the communication of feeling and emotion. The page with Saint Matthew from the Gospel Book of Ebo illustrates a scene in which St. Matthew sits at his desk frantically writing, his face twisted with intense emotion. Saint Matthew's robe, hair, and the sharply bending grasses in the background are made up of repeated linear flourishes. It seems as though Matthew, hunched over and sporting triangular eyebrows, fears divine inspiration will be lost if he does not immediately write down his evangelical text. This manuscript painting, done in gold and colored ink on vellum in the 9th century, is an example of medieval expressionism. The whole scene seems to be blowing in the wind, and the dramatic quality of the work expresses an emotional, rather than purely intellectual element of the Gospels.
What is a daguerreotype?
A daguerreotype is the earliest form of photograph. Invented by the French painter, Louis-Jacques de Daguerre, 1787–1851. In the 1830s, J.N. Niepce had experimented with iodine fumes, and others experimented with additional photosensitive chemicals in an attempt to make a high-quality image. Daguerre later used a silver iodide-covered copper plate and mercury fumes to make a single fixed image. The invention was considered a huge boon for France, and it revolutionized the way history could be recorded. Daguerreotypes became very popular for portraits, but by the latter half of the 19th century. Photography techniques that allowed for multiple prints instead of a single image, replaced the daguerreotype.
What was the Harlem Renaissance?
The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that grew from the 19th century New Negro movement. Intellectuals such as Alain Locke, 1886–1954, called on black artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers to draw inspiration from their African roots rather than white European traditions. Blues and jazz, played by musicians such as Bessie Smith and Duke Ellington, and poetry by writers such as Langston Hughes, were part of a cultural explosion that centered on the New York City urban experience. Visual artists, including the photographer James Van Der Zee, and painters Palmer Hayden, 1890–1964, and Aaron Douglas, whose painting aspects of Negro life, from slavery through Reconstruction, 1934, is an example of the influence of African art styles on black artists during the Harlem Renaissance. The painting represents the history of black Americans and is populated with figurative silhouettes reminiscent of ancient Egyptian paintings. With a limited color palette, Douglas' painting is filled with energy, movement, and sound in its depiction of the Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War Reconstruction, and voting rights. At the far left of the scene, the Ku Klux Klan threaten on horseback. But repeating circles draw attention to a triumphant figure at the center, who holds a ballot in his hand.
How were painters to respond?
As is clear with Impressionism, 19th century artists did not simply stop being interested in realism, this interest merely shifted. Because of the camera, artists in the latter half of the 19th century began to experiment with optical realism and the capturing of movement in a whole new way. In Manet's great painting, Bar at the Folies Bergère, 1881–1882, a room full of dancers appears blurry, as they would in a photograph, and is an indication of movement. Photographs are also notable for their ability to capture a slice of life. And paintings such as Degas' Off-Center l'Absinthe, 1876, does just that. Degas crops the picture by slicing through an angled café table and cutting off the elbow of a cigarette-smoking patron. In a period when artists were already questioning the value of the academic art tradition, the development of photography encouraged 19th century artists to continue to experiment with their techniques and their subjects, and to question the supremacy of classical aesthetic values.
Who was Gustave Courbet?
Unlike Millet, Gustave Courbet, 1819–1877, was open about being inspired by the 1848 revolutions in France. He was known for his socially radical beliefs and his loyalty to his hometown of Ornans, near the border with Switzerland. He believed that artists could only authentically represent their own experiences and rejected traditional academic views on painting. He disliked history painting and believed that art could not be taught. His painting, The Stone Breakers, 1849, predates Millet's depiction of rural poverty, and similarly shows two laborers breaking large stones along the side of a road back-breaking work. There are certain romantic elements to the painting, such as the sense of nostalgia for the simplicity of rural life. And like the gleaners, the faces of the workers are hidden. Some critics considered this painting a satire that juxtaposes demanding physical labor with the mechanical processes of the Industrial Revolution. The canvas is quite large for such a subject at nearly 9 feet long and 5 feet high. Even bigger was Courbet's A Burial at Ornans, 1849. Which depicted a countryside funeral and is over 21 feet long. It was heavily criticized for depicting something as mundane as a poor man's funeral on such a large scale, but that was exactly Courbet's point. The monumentality of the image brings dignity to the ordinary working class and to the rural countryside.
Why are Etruscan tombs built to look like houses?
Known for cremating their dead, the Etruscans seem to have thought of their tombs as being like homes for the dead in the afterlife. The tombs themselves were organized in a grid-like pattern, much like a small downtown. The tomb of the reliefs is a famous Etruscan tomb that features pots, tools, and even couches. All carved from stone and made to look like objects from a normal Etruscan house. There is even a carving of the family dog. But, there is also a carving of Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guards the entrance to the underworld, according to Greek mythology. Much like the Egyptians, the Etruscans attempted to bring the dead the comforts of home.
What was the Barbizon school?
The Barbizon school was a group of French painters who favored plein air landscape painting that broke with neoclassical conventions of idealization. The name of the group came from the small village of Barbizon where many of the founding artists lived. Artists of the Barbizon school, such as Charles François Daubigny, Jean-François Millet, and Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, leaned towards realism and valued close observation of nature. Like artists before and after, they searched for truth, in the rural countryside of France. Although occasionally criticized, the artists of the Barbizon school, whose work is characterized by softness of forms and loose brush strokes, went on to influence 19th-century French realism and impressionism.
Is there such as thing as Impressionist sculpture?
Although he never called himself an Impressionist, the work of highly acclaimed French sculptor Auguste Rodin 18401917 achieves many of the same goals as the work of the Impressionist painters. To capture a sense of fleeting time and capture movement. Rodin's sculpture is characterized by rugged realism and expressive poses. As exemplified in his iconic marble and bronze sculpture, The Thinker. But, Impressionist values can be seen in his controversial sculpture, Monument to Balzac, which Rodin created over 7 years, after a commission from the French Society of Men of Letters in 1891 to commemorate Honoré de Balzac, the French literary giant. This work captures the spirit of Balzac and the monumentality of his creative genius. Like Impressionist paintings, it takes on an unfinished form and emphasizes surface texture. When Rodin shared a plaster model of the sculpture in 1898, it was heavily criticized and the finished bronze and marble cast was not completed until after his death. Despite the initial criticism, the sculpture, and Rodin's overall body of work, is considered to be among the most innovative and significant examples of 19th-century sculpture. And Rodin is credited with foreshadowing modernism. Therefore, not only can Rodin's work be considered impressionist, but it also ushered in a new era of sculptural innovation.
What is mana?
Mana is an important concept in much Pacific art that is essential for understanding the power of art in many Pacific cultures. Mana is a sacred, spiritual power possessed by individuals and art objects alike. It is invisible but formidable, and the amount of mana one has is related to one's proximity to the gods. For example, a tribal chief and related nobles have mana because of their divine lineage. Mana can be gained or lost based on one's actions or behaviors, such as through acts of strength or acts of cowardice, for example. The mana of a work of art is related to the status and skill of the artist who created the piece, as well as the materials used to make it, the age of the object, and the rituals for which it is used.
What is a ziggurat?
A ziggurat is a mountain-like structure formed by a series of steps and topped with a temple or a shrine. Placing shrines and temples at a higher elevation served both practical and religious purposes. Practically speaking, the higher elevation would protect the religious structure from flooding or attack. It also served to glorify the ruler and the gods worshipped at the site. Ziggurats represented a place where heaven and earth met. The ruins of the White Temple at Uruk are located in what is now known as Warka, Iraq. This temple was part of a ziggurat dedicated to the Sumerian god Anu. and housed statues of gods, goddesses, and temple patrons. It was oriented along the points of the compass and had a central chamber with an altar for religious rituals.
Why did Monet paint Rouen Cathedral so many times?
Monet was fascinated by optical realism and painted multiple, over 30 canvases, 184 of the facade of Rouen Cathedral, as an exploration of the properties of ever-changing light and the perception of light by the human eye. Imagine looking across a bright street with squinted eyes, trying to make out the buildings on the other side. With its niches and varied textures, the church facade was a perfect subject for such experimentation. In the intense sunlight, Rouen Cathedral loses detail and its physicality dissolves. Since the sun is constantly moving through the sky, the light reflecting off the building is constantly changing, and Monet attempted to capture the fleeting quality of this light in his work, which is also responsible for the unfinished style. Monet embraced the aesthetic value of the quick sketch, though he meticulously worked on these pictures in his studio at Giverny. And he hoped to capture this in his series of paintings of Rouen Cathedral.
What is picturesque?
Though the literal meaning of picturesque is like a picture, the term refers to the aesthetically pleasing qualities of a painting that come from texture, lighting, composition, and engaging formal irregularities. During the 18th century, British painters found the 17th century landscapes of artists such as Nicolas Poussin and Jacob van Ruysdael to exemplify the picturesque due to their subtlety and mystery. So inspired, British architects even designed gardens after landscape paintings. And during the 19th century, Britain saw a surge in domestic tourism to such picturesque locations as the Lake District and the Scottish Highlands, which were made popular by Romantic poets such as William Wordsworth and Sir Walter Scott.
Who was Hans Holbein?
Hans Holbein the Younger, c. 1497 to 1543, was a leading German painter who went on to become the court painter to English King Henry VIII. Holbein was a skilled realist with great ability to capture texture and fine detail. His work included religious paintings, prints, and even designs for stained glass windows. But he was particularly well known for his portraits, especially his portrait of Henry VIII in 1540. The painting depicts the formidably sized king dressed in his finest clothes against a dark background. The king wears an ornately embroidered coat with yellow, puffed sleeves, fine jewelry, and a feathered hat in celebration of his marriage to Anne of Clovis, his fourth wife. The oil paint captures the rich textures of the fabric and Holbein emphasizes the girth and power of the king's frame. The king's decision to invite a German painter, rather than an Italian artist, to his court highlights the strain between England and Italy after the Reformation.
What is performance art?
Performance art is slightly more complicated than its name might suggest. Performance art is indeed art that blends music, theatrical performance, and visual art, rather than a single painting or sculpture. But, the form itself, which became more popular in the 1960s, also blurs the line between art and artist, and frequently produces an uncomfortable reaction amongst viewers. For example, the artists Gilbert and George sing for over 8 hours in their performance. The Singing Sculpture, 1969. In a performance piece titled How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, 1968. The often provocative artist Joseph Beuys holds a dead hare in his arms while appearing to whisper to it. A good example of the way in which both art and artist merge is Yoko Ono's 1964 performance. Cut piece, in which audience participants are invited to cut off pieces of Ono's clothing until none remain. This performance is also categorized as an example of Fluxus art.
What does the Farm Security Administration have to do with art?
In 1935, the Farm Security Administration, FSA, was established in order to document and communicate the devastating impact of the Great Depression, especially on farm workers and the rural poor. American economist Roy Stryker hired a team of photographers that included Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange, among others. Walker Evans, 1903 to 1975, had studied literature in Paris and was direct in his approach to photography. His work powerfully documents struggling families, notably in West Virginia, during the period between World Wars I and II. Dorothea Lange, 1895 to 1965, had a photography studio in San Francisco, but when hired by Roy Stryker, she traveled to see firsthand what migrant farm workers had to endure. Her photographs, including Migrant Mother, 1936, Migratory Cotton Picker, 1940, and Wife of a Migratory Farmer in Her Makeshift Tent Home, are eloquent and forceful.
What is composition?
The term composition refers to the arrangement of forms in a work of art. When art historians analyze the composition of a work of art, they are often interested in balance. The repetition of shapes, the use of perspective, and any sense of depth in the work.
What is Buddhism?
Buddhism developed in India during the Mauryan period, 322 to 185 BCE, and became the official religion of Emperor Ashoka, who ruled between 273 and 232 BCE. Buddhism is founded upon the teachings of Buddha, the Enlightened One. Buddha was born Siddhartha Gautama, a wealthy prince. It was foretold that Siddhartha would become either a great military leader or a fully awakened being. After he reached enlightenment, the Buddha held his first teachings in which he explained the Four Noble Truths. The Noble Truths make up the foundation of Buddhist philosophy. They are as follows: life is dukkha, translated as suffering, stress, or dissatisfaction. The cause of dukkha is tanha, translated as craving or clinging. Dukkha can be extinguished. The way to extinguish dukkha is by following the Eightfold Path in the Buddhist tradition. The Eightfold Path is a set of principles for achieving nirvana, a state in which one escapes from the recurring cycle of death and rebirth and is free from dukkha. The Buddha's teaching is often symbolized as a wheel, known as the wheel of law.
What is the Venus of Urbino?
Titian painted the Venus of Urbino for Guidobaldo della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino, in 1538. The painting is unabashedly erotic, depicting a nude woman reclining on a disheveled white sheet covering deep red cushions. Her long, red hair sweeps around her neck and her hand rests gently along her hips, only partially covering her sex. She stares teasingly from within the frame, a tiny dog curled near her feet. In the background of the painting, two women appear to be rifling through a chest, collecting clothing. There is no question, Titian has created a goddess. The provocative painting, part of a long tradition of female nudes in the history of art, influenced artists even hundreds of years later. Manet's similarly bold, Olympia, 1863, would not exist without the Venus of Urbino.
Who was Jean Augusta Dominique Ingres?
The art of French painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, 1780 to 1867, exhibits a curious combination of neoclassical and romantic values, though he was determined to hold on to traditional neoclassical values and was considered a nemesis of the much looser Delacroix. He was inspired by the Renaissance painting of Raphael, as well as the revolutionary artist, Jacques-Louis David. While interested in history painting, Ingres is better known for his sensual portraits of female nudes, especially paintings such as La Grande Odalisque, 1814, which depicts a sultan's concubine reclined languidly on luxurious, colorful fabrics. La Grande Odalisque is an example of Orientalism, or a romantic interest in the exotic East. In the painting, the elongated form of the concubine, along with objects of Eastern luxury, such as a fan made of peacock feathers and ornate jewelry, were decidedly romantic. Despite angry preference for neoclassicism and apparent distaste for portraiture,
What is Klimt's golden style?
Gustav Klimt was an Austrian artist who was the first president of a group called the Vienna Secession, a group of artists that favored highly decorative styles aligned to Art Nouveau, and wanted to break from the conservative artistic traditions of the Austrian Academy. Klimt applied gold leaf to many of his works, the most famous being The Kiss, 1907 to 1908, which depicts two lovers in a vulnerable embrace. The highly decorative style of the piece fits appropriately into the Art Nouveau aesthetic. But the ornate quality of Klimt's work belies its complexity. Klimt's golden masterpieces, and his legacy, are still hotly debated by art critics and historians who argue about his impact on the history of art. But, in 2006, his silver and gold leafed oil painting, Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I. 1907, sold for a reported $135 million, making it, temporarily, the most expensive painting ever sold.
What are the main characteristics of Gothic architecture?
Gothic architecture developed as a major European style in France in the middle of the 12th century and is characterized by the use of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses. These structural forms allowed medieval masons to achieve never-before-seen heights and much thinner walls than seen in Romanesque churches, as well as the addition of huge stained glass windows, such as the rose window at Chartres Cathedral in France. Gothic architecture was enormously popular in Europe, especially in France, until the end of the 15th century, and even into the 16th century in some countries. Though it was never particularly popular in Italy, which preferred the Romanesque style.
What is Baroque classicism?
Baroque classicism is a specific style of Baroque art that draws heavily on classical influences and is characterized by refined idealism, realism, and an interest in antiquity. The dramatic use of chiaroscuro is not quite as evident in Baroque classicism. It was most popular in France, and preferred by the painters such as Nicolas Poussin, Claude Lorraine, Charles Lebrun, and the architect Louis Vaux. Some art historians consider the Italian Annibale Carracci, whose work greatly influenced Poussin, a classicist as well.
What is the Corinthian order?
The Corinthian order was the last of the three classical Greek orders of architecture to develop. The tallest and most elaborate of the three orders, a Corinthian column is built at a ratio of approximately 13:1. Which means the height of the column is 13 times taller than the width. Originally designed for interior use. The Corinthian order features a capital decorated with flowers and leaves of the acanthus plant. While the Doric and Ionic order feature a corniced entablature, the Corinthian entablature is flat. According to the Roman architect and writer Vitruvius, and later repeated by the Renaissance writer Vasari, the artist and poet Callimachus was inspired to design the Corinthian capital after seeing a basket of overgrown acanthus leaves placed in front of a young girl's grave in the Greek city-state of Corinth. The Temple of Olympian Zeus is a Hellenistic temple that was started using the Doric order, but finished years later using the Corinthian order. The temple's massive columns are over 55 feet high. Classically inspired modern buildings continue to incorporate the Corinthian design, including the General Post Office in New York and the U.S. Capitol Building.
What are the classical Greek orders of architecture?
Greek architects followed fairly strict conventions when designing temples in an attempt to produce a balanced and unified look, an aesthetic valued by the Greeks. The three main orders, or patterns of temple building design are, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. Referred to as the classical Greek orders of architecture. These systems of proportion and style made a profound impact on the history of architecture and continue to be incorporated into building design to this day.
Who was Giorgione?
Very little is known about the Venetian painter Giorgione. He was born in 1478 in the northern Italian town, Castelfranco. Was a student under Giovanni Bellini, and died of the plague in 1510. He was an innovative painter credited with ushering in the High Renaissance in Venice. He emphasized landscape in his work, which was popular in Venice at the time, and rendered both landscapes and portraits meaningful through the extensive use of symbolism. According to the writer Vasari, Giorgione was inspired by the sfumato technique used by Leonardo da Vinci, and preferred to draw directly on the canvas, rather than do preparatory drawings on paper. Attributing specific paintings to Giorgione is extremely difficult, and scholars have only confirmed 5 paintings as being from his hand. His most famous surviving painting, The Tempest, is of a forested landscape with a lightning storm in the background. A breastfeeding woman sits partially covered by some vegetation, while a red-jacketed solitaire watches her from afar. The mysterious painting enthralls scholars and other viewers, who continue to wonder at its meaning.
Who was Nam June Paik?
Nam June Paik, 1932 to 2006, was a Korean-American artist who worked in many different media, creating videotapes, paintings, sculptures, robots, laser installations, and writing. He is best known as an innovator in video art. Paik joined Fluxus while studying in Germany and was later inspired by the experimental composer and artist John Cage, who he met and befriended in 1958. Paik used the video as a structural component in his sculptures and installations. For example, he made a cello by stacking television sets and stringing them together with cello strings. He also made a bra out of 2 television screens in a work titled, TV Bra for Living Sculpture, 1969. Which he designed to be worn by cello player and collaborator, Charlotte Moorman, while she performed. Paik's video Flag X, 1985, is another example of video used in sculpture. A series of television screens are arranged in a grid pattern to display an image of the American flag.
What is an altarpiece?
An altarpiece is a painted wood panel, usually placed on the altar in a church. Altarpieces come in many forms. One of the most common types of altarpieces is the triptych. So named because it is made up 3 connected panels. Often, the panels of a triptych are hinged and the outer panels can be closed like doors, revealing additional exterior paintings. An altarpiece with only 2 panels is called a diptych, while an altarpiece with many panels, such as the Ghent altarpiece, discussed in the following section, is known as a polyptych.
What is photorealism?
Photorealism, also called superrealism, sharp focus realism, and hyperrealism, developed in the 1970s as an extension of minimalism and pop art. It can even be considered a great-grandchild to precisionism. Photorealistic paintings were influenced by photographic and media images, and like pop art, often feature impersonal, even banal subject matter inspired by everyday life. American photorealist artist Chuck Close, 1940, makes paintings so realistic that they seem like photographs by using a photo as a reference and painting his image on a grid with an airbrush. The artist Audrey Flack, 1931, creates photorealistic still life paintings that recall Baroque Vanitas paintings. Photorealism often relies on trompe-l'oeil, which means trick of the eye to communicate meaning and comment on social, political, and cultural themes. Other artists associated with photorealism include Robert Bechtel, 1932, Richard Estes, 1932, and British artist Malcolm Morley, 1931.
What is mobiliary art?
Paleolithic art can be broken down into two general categories, mobiliary and parietal art. As Paleolithic people were migratory, they needed to carry their belongings with them as they traveled great distances. Mobiliary is a term that describes mobile art, or art that can be carried without too much physical effort. The most common examples include small sculptures.
How is the Italian Renaissance different from the Renaissance in Northern Europe?
The Renaissance is said to have started in Italy and spread slowly north into the rest of Europe. This is not quite true, however. While the Italians were especially interested in classical art, they lived amongst Roman ruins after all. Artists from northern European countries such as France, Germany, and the Netherlands had different interests. While artists of the Italian Renaissance were interested in the idealized nude, classical architecture, and single-point perspective. Northern European painting of the time is characterized by intense realism and attention to detail. Northern artists were interested in the material quality of objects in the visible world. Important artists of the Northern Renaissance include Jan van Eyck, Roger van der Weyden, and Claes Slutter.
What is 19th century symbolism?
The 19th century symbolist movement began as a literary movement in France. Symbolist artists and writers made works that were inspired by dreams, myths, folklore, and the new psychological concept of the unconscious, as described by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. French poets, including Stéphane Mallarmé, Charles Baudelaire, and Paul Verlaine, strived to elevate their work with symbols in an attempt to avoid the limitations of material reality. Gustave Moreau, 1826–1898, and Odilon Redon, 1840–1916, were French artists who embraced symbolism. While the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch, 1863–1944, is perhaps the most well-known symbolist painter outside of France. Munch's The Scream is a swirling depiction of intense emotion. Munch wrote about it in a journal, saying, "I sensed a shriek passing through nature. I painted this picture. Painted the clouds as actual blood," as quoted in Stockstad 1050. Other notable symbolists include Belgian artist James Ensor, and the American Albert Pinkham Ryder. Many symbolist paintings are characterized by a dark moods and macabre subject matter.
What is a miniature painting?
Particularly popular in Persian, Ottoman, and Mughal traditions, miniature paintings are small works on paper. Whether book illustrations or separate paintings kept in albums, known as a muraksa. Miniature paintings were not framed and not displayed on walls, but were meant to be held in one's hands. Miniature painting required years of training and apprenticeship to create. One of the most important centers of miniature painting was the Royal Herat School in Afghanistan, where students were instructed on painting and calligraphy. During the early 16th century, the school was moved to Tabriz, Iran. Miniature painters sat on the ground with one knee bent to support the painting board. Multiple layers of colors derived from pigments were applied, including gold, and then the painting was burnished.
What is the Palace of Knossos?
The mysterious Minoan culture is famous for the labyrinthine Palace of Knossos. Discovered on the island of Crete in 1900 by the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans. Evans called his discovery the Palace of Minos, referring to the mythological maze which imprisoned the Minotaur. The Knossos Palace complex contained hundreds of rooms of various sizes and shapes, including storerooms, workrooms, and administrative rooms. One storeroom was so large it could hold over 20,000 gallons of oil in jars. While the layout of the palace appears disjointed and confusing, each space was designed to have access to fresh air and plumbing, and was elaborately decorated with wall paintings and frescoes. The palace appears to have been completely destroyed and rebuilt, and Minoan culture seems to have been severely disrupted by at least one major natural disaster, possibly a catastrophic earthquake or volcanic eruption or both.
What makes art good or bad?
If you've gone to see a movie with a friend and argued about whether the film you both just saw was either good or bad, you are familiar with the foundations of art criticism. Your friend might believe The Matrix is a groundbreaking film with profound themes and solid acting, while you might completely disagree. When the arguing has continued for hours after the closing credits, it will perhaps become apparent that nothing you can say about the awkward romance or flashy graphics will convince your friend of your opinion. In the end, you agree to disagree. The same is true when evaluating a work of art. When writing, critics think about the skill of the artist, technique, form, and meaning of a work, but in the end, everything is debatable. Duchamp's urinal, fountain, is not inherently good art or bad art. Some critics believe it is profound while others write it off as a stunt. Arguing about whether it is good or bad is not only part of the fun of art appreciation, but is an integral part of art historical scholarship.
What is a Navajo sand painting?
Sand painting is an essential part of traditional healing ceremonies for the Native American. Navajo people of the American Southwest. Using natural materials such as colorful powdered stones, pigments, and even corn pollen, Navajo medicine men ritualistically recreate the mythological journeys of gods and heroes to form complex images with healing powers. Navajo sand paintings, also called dry paintings, are often composed of highly stylized, repetitive geometric forms such as curved and angled lines. Completed paintings are never publicly shared and they are destroyed once the ceremony is over. Though some sand painting imagery has been published, and photographs are owned by the Library of Congress and other institutions, strict adherence to ritual tradition is necessarily in order for the healing ceremony to be successful. The American abstract expressionist artist, Jackson Pollock, was inspired by the process of creating the sand painting, which is laid flat on the ground while the artist stands over it, a process Pollock used when making his own art.
What are pastels?
Pastels are a popular medium used for drawing. To make pastels, gum or resin is added to pigment and formed into the shape of a small stick. When pastels are applied to a surface, the colors can appear powdery and can be smeared or blended with the tip of a finger. When completed, pastel paintings need to be fixed with a spray or the colors can smear. Though these sprays can sometimes cause discoloration. Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt are famous Impressionist artists known for their use of pastels.
What are the plastered skulls of Jericho?
The people of Neolithic Jericho buried their dead under the floors of their houses in a practice interpreted as a form of ancestor worship, while complete bodies were often buried. Sometimes the head was removed and carefully reconstructed using colored plaster. Red and black paint was used to mimic facial features and shells, such as cowries, were used to create white eyes. The result was a lifelike representation of the deceased, and the practice has been considered by some scholars to be one of the earliest examples of portrait making. Similar examples of plastered skulls have been found at other sites across the Near East.
Who was Eugene Delacroix?
Eugene Delacroix, 1798 to 1863. Was not interested in the defined forms and classical stoicism promoted by the Academy. This French Romantic painter is known for his use of thick brush strokes, and sweeping, dramatic scenes inspired by mythology, current events, and his trips to North Africa. Delacroix's Massacre at Chios, 1822 to 1824, was based on the Greek struggle for independence from the Ottoman Empire. an event that influenced many Romantic writers and artists. The painting communicates sympathy for the exhausted Greeks by focusing on the details of individual faces. A menacing Turk dominates the scene as his dark horses rears up over the group of victims. Similarly, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, July 28, 1830, 1830, makes heroes of unlikely revolutionaries, who passionately take up arms as their brethren have fallen, ready to overthrow the monarchy. Red, white, and blue, the colors of the French flag, draw attention to the female personification of liberty, whose bare breast recalls classic sculpture, as she emerges from the dust and smoke. She holds up the French flag in one hand and a bayonet in the other, leading the revolutionaries into battle. This Romantic painting emphasizes idealism and heroism in its depiction of an important historical event.
How is pre-Columbian art in North America organized?
In North America, pre-Columbian art is divided into three major periods. Archaic period, ends in c. 1000 BCE. Woodland period, c. 300 B.C.E-1000 CE. Mississippian period, c. 900-1500 CE.
Why is the tiny Tempietto an important example of high Renaissance architecture?
The Tempietto is a small, circular church, officially called the Church of San Pietro in Montorio, Rome. It was designed around 1502 by Donato Bramante, a famed architect from Urbino who was later hired to design St. Peter's Cathedral. Tempietto means little temple, and its style is reminiscent of an ancient pagan temple. It was built over what is believed to be the site of St. Peter's crucifixion and housed relics associated with the apostle. Bramante's design was very much in tune with classical aesthetics popular during the Renaissance, especially in Italy. The architectural elements are mathematically proportioned and the overall style is unified, making the building almost like a work of sculpture. The simplicity of the exterior, along with the use of classical columns, a dome, and hemispherical entablature, inspired many other building projects in Rome. Though small, the Tempietto is one of the most significant examples of high Renaissance architecture in Italy.
What is considered beautiful in Islamic art?
The Arabic word for beautiful is jamil. To be considered beautiful, Islamic art must be symmetrical, unified, and balanced. These aesthetic principles are also valued in classical Greek and Roman cultures, which influenced early Islamic art. An additional quality of Islamic art is that it should also be astonishing. The medieval philosopher Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazan, said visible objects are appealing due to the composition and order of their parts among themselves, as quoted in O'Reilly 25. This attitude towards beauty helps to explain why Islamic art is often so intricate and detailed, and yet balanced and harmonious.
What is Internet art?
Artists continually mine new technologies for possible artistic media. From acrylic paints to plastics, electronics to the World Wide Web. Internet art, or net art, is a newly emerging form of digital art and can be interactive, collaborative, and accessible. Internet art is unique amongst art forms for its ability to reach a global audience in the click of a button. In 1995, the website Artei was created as an online gallery hosting virtual art installations by established artists such as Felix González Torres. 1957 to 1996, and Jenny Halser, 1950, who exhibited her truisms on Artei. Another example of net art includes Russian artist Olya Lyelina's interactive piece, My Boyfriend Came Back from the War, 1996, which tells a story by allowing site visitors to click on different hypertext links and GIFs, digital images in graphics interchange format. Internet art continues to expand, with many museums and galleries launching art websites, and new digital artists who explore the medium.
Who was Jan van Eyck?
Jan van Eyck, d. 1441, was one of the most significant painters of the 15th century. He worked in Burgundy and is most well known for the Ghent altarpiece, a monumental work of tremendous realism and detail. Jan van Eyck came from a family of artists and was known to have worked alongside his brother, Hubert. The Van Eyck brothers likely worked together on the Ghent altarpiece. Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, was one of their most significant patrons. Some of Van Eyck's most important paintings include Portrait of a Man in a Turban, 1433, which might be a self-portrait, and the Arnolfini portrait, 1434.
Are those human hands?
Yes. Overall, there are not many depictions of humans in Paleolithic art, and those images of humans that do exist are not as realistically rendered as images of animals. Floating around the top and bottom of a painting of two spotted horses from the Pecmerle Cave in Dordogne, France, are the outlines of human hands. It is tempting to think that Paleolithic artists were merely playing around making handprints on the wall. but these images were purposefully done. Some of the hands seem to have been made by pressing a painted hand against the cave wall. Other handprints were made by using the hand to create negative space. Paleolithic artists used their hands like a stencil and either, essentially, sponge painted or sprayed pigment with a reed or bone to create the outline.
Who was Eva Hesse?
Eva Hesse, 1936 to 1970. Was a German-American painter and sculptor whose Jewish family dramatically escaped Nazi Germany. Her highly experimental art is usually categorized as minimalist, however. Unlike many minimalists, narrative and personal history are an important part of her work. Her installation sculpture Rope Piece, 1969 to 1970, a tangled, slightly frightening web of rope, string, and wire, has a different form each time it is moved to a new location. The piece has been described as a drawing in space. Her work Accession to, 1968 to 1969, now at the Detroit Institute of Art, is a cube made of vinyl and steel. The cube is open at the top, revealing a lush layer of fiber-like tubes, a reaction against the severity of much minimalist art.